Hello. In this set of video lectures, we'll be covering auditing fundamentals. And again, physicians and other practitioners do have challenges understanding coding guidelines and therefore have problems at times with the correct CPT and the HCPCS and diagnosis codes. Performing a coding audit along with ongoing monitoring and education assists the practice in meeting the goal of compliant coding and appropriate reimbursement. Some of the top coding errors, upcoding. Some providers feel that they're never going to be scrutinized if they downcode. Unfortunately, that's not correct. Also, the chief complaint or the reason from the visit is frequently missing from encounters. The assessment is not clearly documented. With some electronic health record systems, things don't get properly authenticated, meaning signed. And tests that are ordered are not listed in the documentation, but they're still billed. Sometimes the documenting of medication isn't clear, particularly with paper records. And the diagnosis code is not clear and does not match up with the diagnosis itself. Dictations can be lost. And with paper records, the super bill isn't available. The Office of the Inspector General, the OIG, expects medical practices to have a compliance plan that includes medical record auditing. At a minimum, it is expected to be done once a year. Based on the OIG standards, 95% coding accuracy is the expectation in every medical practice. So what's the difference between coding and auditing? When you're coding, you're selecting the appropriate code based on the medical record documentation. When you're auditing, the auditor is analyzing the record and ensuring that the date of service is reviewed, the history is complete, medications are documented, and everything is appropriately documented to support whatever service, procedure, or diagnosis codes are submitted. So who should perform the audit? Many practices prefer external auditors because they're objective in determining whether problems exist, but also in developing a remedy for any issues. There are advantages to using an internal auditor, such as somebody who's within the practice as they know the practice well and they're able to provide a more focused look at the practice than what an external auditor can do. So what's the difference between auditing and monitoring? Auditing is examining the record to make sure the documentation supports the codes that are submitted. Monitoring is ongoing process of reviewing a practice's coding and the adequacy of the documentation and code selection. In a practice, there are usually three main types of audits. They can be before the claim is submitted, which is a prepayment audit. They can be after the claim is submitted and paid, which is a retrospective audit. Or it can be a focused review. In other words, a review done on certain types of claims based on problems that are identified. There are many different audit tools on the market. These include software applications, paper forms, but the purpose of an audit tool is to collect data on the audit. Once you begin auditing patient encounters on a regular basis, you may want to research what options are available for auditing. We begin the audit process. In addition to the audit tool, we want to have a complete medical record and all documentation available to make sure that we're discovering not only non-compliant coding, but any opportunities for lost revenue. An important thing is to consider what the objective of the audit is. This could include revenue chart audits, which look at such things as underbilling, non-billed, overbilled, denied services, or downcoding. The compliance chart objective is looking for things that are compliant with payer standards, such as Medicare, Medicaid, third-party payers. And when looking at these issues, such things we audit for are signatures, demographics, insurance claim forms, teaching physician guidelines, which is a very common audit concern in teaching hospitals that have residents, interns, and fellows. Once we have the data, we want to analyze and report on the audit findings. Reports that outline any patterns of over or underutilization also are helpful to use with the review of the audit findings. There are 4 reporting mechanisms that are useful for coding improvement. One is the detailed review analysis. So in other words, using some data in a table, it includes the patient identification and the codes that are selected. A summary report is aggregate data that talks about the documentation compliance areas, the problem areas, and offers areas for improvement. The aggregate summary is a report that is identifying the health of the organization's coding and documentation practices as a whole. And then finally, the utilization report is basically a profile that evaluates E&M patterns or other services. So for instance, one practice I'm familiar with had a whole lot of level 5 E&Ms that seemed to be outliers. You can get all the reports you want, you can collect all the data that you have, but unless you communicate them to the practitioner, the audits are of little value. Typically, this involves a meeting with the practitioner and discusses certain target areas and sets priorities. After the initial audit, it's important to continue to monitor to ensure that improvements are being made. It may be helpful to have a production calendar for subsequent audits, and this could be monthly, quarterly, annually, what have you, depending on what the earlier findings were. Once you've communicated the results, there should be education and training. Areas such that I've been involved with include Modifier 25 and other types of education and training. Some training suggestions include reviewing areas where there are problems. Some practices have monthly staff meetings where this is discussed, along with Medicare bulletins, fraud alerts, and other pertinent information. An important thing for us in health information is to discuss the annual coding changes that happen to ensure that providers are documenting and doing things that support appropriate codes. And that's all I have for you. We'll see you next time. Bye now.